In September 1982, a death certificate was filed in a quiet Toronto hospital for a woman named Lady Iris Mountbatten. Under next of kin, the staff could have listed Queen Elizabeth II or Prince Philip, but no one from Buckingham Palace was there to hold her hand. Instead, the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria died broke, alone, and effectively erased from history by the very family she was born into. This was the woman who committed the one sin the House of Windsor deems unforgivable. She didn't just break the rules, she became a public joke. From holding the Queen's train at the Coronation to being fingerprinted in an American police station for a bad check, and from living in Kensington Palace to modeling for potato chips to pay the rent, Lady Iris's life was a spectacular, humiliating freefall. While the Mountbattens are celebrated as the masterminds of the modern monarchy, Iris was the wreckage they left behind. This is not merely a story of a royal black sheep. It is the brutal autopsy of a dynastic sacrifice, revealing how the most powerful family in the world protected its image by ruthlessly crushing the one woman who dared to be human, leaving her to drift across the Atlantic as the ultimate cautionary tale. She was not born on the periphery of the royal ecosystem. She was born at its blazing epicenter on a cold January day in 1920 in the shadow of the Great War's aftermath. She was the only child of the Marquis of Carisbrooke, Alexander Mountbatten, and Lady Irene Denison. On paper, her birth was a celebration of continuity, a reinforcement of the bloodline that stretched directly back to Queen Victoria. Her father, known to the family as Drino, was Queen Victoria's favorite grandson, the apple of the old matriarch's eye in her final twilight years. He was a man of the old world, a figure of gentle manners and artistic temperament, but the dominant force in the family, the energy that would define Iris's life and ultimately destroy it, was not her father's gentle aristocracy, but the terrifying ambition of the Mountbatten clan itself. They were a family on the make, a German dynasty, the Battenbergs, that had been forced to anglicize their name to Mountbatten during the anti-German hysteria of World War I. This rebranding was not just a change of stationery, it was a psychological reset. Under the de facto leadership of Iris's uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, Uncle Dickie, the family developed a collective chip on its shoulder, a ferocious drive to prove that they were more British than the British, more royal than the royals. They were the climbers, the fixers, the strategists. And in a family of sharks, Iris was born a tropical fish, beautiful, decorative, and hopelessly ill-equipped for the predatory waters she was expected to navigate. The environment of her childhood was Kensington Palace, but not the modernized, celebrity-filled compound we recognize today. In the 1920s and 30s, Kensington Palace was a gilded ghetto, a doll's house for the minor royals and the elderly aunts of the dynasty. It was a place of hushed corridors, dust motes dancing in the light of high windows, and an oppressive, suffocating adherence to protocol. Iris grew up in apartment 2, a sprawling residence filled with the heavy furniture of the Victorian era and the ghosts of the past. Her playmates were the future Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, her cousins who lived just across the way. But even then, in the nursery, a subtle apartheid of destiny was at work. Elizabeth was the sensible one, the responsible one, the one who seemed to understand instinctively that her life belonged to the state. Iris was different. She was the golden child, possessed of a startling violet-eyed beauty and a restless bohemian spirit that chafed against the rigid expectations of her station. She was not built for the silent, stiff upper lip duty that defined her cousins. She was vibrant, impulsive, and deeply sensitive, traits that are celebrated in the real world, but are considered dangerous defects in a royal court. The psychological landscape of her parents' marriage further sowed the seeds of her future instability. Her father, the Marquis, was a man out of time, a shy, aesthetic soul who preferred interior decoration and the company of artistic young men to the rough and tumble of military life or the boredom of state banquets. There were constant whispers, never spoken aloud, but hanging in the air like smoke, about his sexuality. In the aristocracy of the time, such things were tolerated as long as they were discreet, as long as the facade of the happy family was maintained. Her mother, Lady Irene, was a formidable creature of the Edwardian age, extravagant, demanding, and obsessed with surface appearances. She spent money with a ferocity that bordered on pathology, dressing Iris in the finest lace and silks, parading her like a prize doll, while the family finances quietly bled out in the background. Iris learned early on that life was a performance. You smiled, you waved, you wore the dress, and you never, ever let the mask slip. She learned that love was conditional on good behavior, and that good behavior meant looking perfect in a photograph. It was a childhood devoid of emotional safety, a nursery built on the San Andreas fault of repressed secrets and financial precarity, disguised as the pinnacle of British stability. As the 1930s dawned, bringing with them the jazz age and the slow rumble of the coming war, Iris blossomed into a debutante of breathtaking glamour. She was, by all accounts, the it girl of the royal set. The press adored her. She was photographed at balls, at charity fetes, at the races, always impeccable, always smiling, that practiced Windsor smile. In 1937, at the coronation of King George VI, she was chosen to hold the train of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a role of immense symbolic importance. Standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace waving to the roaring crowds below, she looked like the epitome of royal success. She was the insider, the beautiful cousin, the woman who had everything. But beneath the tulle and the diamonds, a deep, gnawing emptiness was growing. Iris was bored. Not the boredom of a rainy Sunday, but the existential boredom of a bird in a cage. She looked at her future, a marriage to a suitable duke, a life of opening flower shows, a slow march toward a respectable death, and she felt a rising panic. She saw the machinery of the firm closing in around her, the machinery that had already crushed her uncle, King Edward VIII, forcing his abdication just a year prior. She saw how quickly the family turned on those who prioritized personal happiness over duty, how the traitor king was exiled to France. But instead of frightening her into submission, the abdication crisis seemed to spark a dangerous idea in Iris's mind, the idea that there was a world outside. The tragedy of Iris is that she possessed the desire for rebellion, but lacked the tools for survival. She wanted the freedom of the jazz age, but she had been raised with the helplessness of a princess. She had never been taught to balance a checkbook, to cook a meal, to understand the value of a pound note. She had been trained only to be, not to do. This disconnect between her internal desires and her practical capabilities created a perilous vulnerability. She began to sneak out, to visit the nightclubs of London's West End, seeking the thrill of the forbidden. She was drawn to the music, the smoke, the people who didn't care about precedence. It was a classic rebellion, but for a Mountbatten, it was playing with fire. Her Uncle Dickie, watching from the wings, was already plotting the family's ascent. He was grooming young Philip of Greece, the future Duke of Edinburgh, for greatness. Biographers often portray him as treating the family almost like a military unit, in which there was little tolerance for a loose cannon. Iris's late-night escapades, her flirtations with the wrong sort of people, were noted in the ledger. The family was watching, and they were not amused. They saw her not as a young woman finding her way, but as a potential leak in the hull of the ship they were trying to steer toward the throne. Then came the war. The Second World War is often romanticized as a time when the royal family was united with the people in suffering, the king and queen amidst the rubble of the Blitz. For Iris, the war was a catalyst for chaos. The rigid structures of society began to melt in the heat of the conflict. The balls stopped, the servants were drafted, and the lights went out across London. Iris, swept up in the patriotic fervor but also desperate for a purpose, joined the war effort as a nurse's aide. For the first time in her life, she saw blood, she saw death, she saw the raw, unvarnished reality of the human body. It was a shock to her system, a violent intrusion of the real world into her sheltered existence. But it was also liberating. In the chaos of the Blitz, the old rules didn't seem to apply. Who cared about etiquette when the Luftwaffe was dropping bombs? It was in this frenetic, live-for-today atmosphere that she made her first catastrophic mistake, her marriage to Captain Hamilton O'Malley. The marriage, which took place in 1941, was hailed in the press as a romantic wartime union, the beautiful royal cousin and the dashing Irish Guards officer. But behind the closed doors of their marital home, the reality was a nightmare. O'Malley was not the Prince Charming of the storybooks. He was a man with a temper, a man who allegedly did not treat the Queen's cousin with the reverence she had been taught to expect. The union disintegrated almost as soon as it began, dissolving into a haze of incompatibility and alleged domestic turbulence. For a woman of her class in that era, a failed marriage was not just a personal heartbreak, it was a social disaster. Divorce was still a dirty word, a scandal that barred you from the royal enclosure at Ascot, a mark of moral failure. But Iris, driven by that same reckless spirit that had sent her to the jazz clubs, refused to suffer in silence. She left him. By 1946, the divorce was finalized. At the age of 26, Lady Iris Mountbatten was a divorcee in a country that was exhausted, gray, and morally rigid. She looked around at the bomb sites of London, at the austere, rationing, pinched faces of the aristocracy, and she felt the walls closing in again. She realized that in England, she would forever be the divorced Marchioness's daughter, a woman with a past, a woman to be whispered about. It was then that she looked west. Across the ocean, America was booming. It was the land of technicolor, of skyscrapers, of endless possibility. It was the land where you could reinvent yourself, where a title was a novelty, not a straitjacket. To Iris, blinded by the movies and the desperation to escape the suffocating judgment of her family, New York looked like salvation. She did not realize she was looking at a mirage. She convinced herself that she could go to America, use her name to open doors, and perhaps find a career, a new husband, a life of her own design. She did not understand that she was trading one cage for another, trading the gilded cage of Kensington Palace for the Shark Tank of American celebrity culture. She did not understand that to the Americans, she was not a person, she was a commodity. She was a Mountbatten to be bought, sold, and displayed like a rare animal in a zoo. Her decision to sail for New York in 1946 was the turning point, the moment she stepped off the precipice. As she boarded the ship, leaving behind the gray skies of post-war Britain, she likely felt a surge of exhilaration. She was escaping the watchful eyes of Uncle Dickie, escaping the pitying glances of the court, escaping the ghost of her failed marriage. She was taking control of her narrative. But unbeknownst to her, the machinery of the family she was leaving behind was shifting gears. Back in London, Lord Mountbatten was preparing for the final push of his grand strategy. the marriage of his nephew Philip to the future Queen Elizabeth. The stakes were absolute. The monarchy was fragile. The country was changing. The family needed to project an image of unimpeachable stability and traditional virtue. They needed to be boring. They needed to be safe. And a wild, divorced niece running loose in New York City looking for fame and fortune was a variable they could not control. As the ship cut through the Atlantic waves, carrying Iris toward the neon lights of Manhattan, she was also sailing away from the only protection she had ever known. She was sailing into a world that would chew her up and spit her out, while her family, the architects of empires, would quietly, methodically lock the gates behind her. The stage was set for a tragedy of Greek proportions, the hubris of a woman who thought she could outrun her heritage, and the ruthless pragmatism of a family that would rather see her destroyed than let her embarrass the crown. This voyage across the Atlantic was not merely a physical relocation. It was a psychological crossing from the structured safety of the past into a volatile, unscripted future. As the gray coastline of England faded into the mist, so too did the invisible shield of deference that had protected her since birth. She was sailing away from the austerity of a recovering empire and toward the intoxicating, dangerous promise of a new world, unaware that the ocean between her and her family would soon become an unbridgeable expanse of silence and shame. When Lady Iris stepped onto the pier in New York City in 1946, the humidity of the American summer hit her like a physical embrace, a stark contrast to the damp, bone-chilling fog she had left behind in London. But it wasn't just the weather that was different. It was the frequency of the world itself. Europe was a graveyard, a continent of rubble, rationing coupons, and hollow-eyed survivors picking through the debris of the Third Reich. New York was a machine of pure, unadulterated optimism. It was a city of neon, of jazz that spilled out onto the sidewalks, of skyscrapers that scraped the belly of the sky, screaming that the future belonged to the new, not the old. For a woman who had spent 26 years being told to lower her voice, to sit up straight, and to mourn the past, Manhattan was an intoxicant more potent than any champagne served at Buckingham Palace. She arrived with trunks full of Hartnell gowns that were slightly out of fashion and a title that was thousands of years old, convinced that she had finally found a stage big enough for her personality. She believed she was the star of the show. She did not realize she was merely the latest novelty act in a city that consumes novelty for breakfast and discards the rind by lunch. The initial reception was deceptively warm, a honeymoon phase that fed her most dangerous delusions. The American press, starved for glamour after the austerity of the war years, devoured her. Here was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a cousin of the king, walking down Fifth Avenue. She was treated not as a refugee from a broken marriage, but as an ambassador of the old country. Hostesses fought to have her at their dinner parties. Head waiters snapped their fingers to clear in tables at the Stork Club when she walked in. For a brief, shining moment, Iris felt that she had pulled off the impossible. She had escaped the suffocating gravity of the Mountbatten family and created a new orbit where she was the sun. She began to speak of career and independence, words that would have caused her Uncle Dickie to choke on his tea back in London. She talked of acting, of modeling, of using her unique perspective to bridge the gap between the aristocracy and the democracy. It was a charming fantasy, but underneath the flashbulbs, the tectonic plates of her reality were shifting. The fundamental problem was one of economics, a subject that had been omitted from her education in the Kensington Palace nursery. In the royal family, money is never discussed. It is simply there, like the air or the rain. But in New York, money was the only thing that mattered. Iris had the taste of a marchioness, the need for maids, for suites at the best hotels, for couture, but she had the bank balance of a struggling artist. Her allowance from home was restricted by the strict post-war currency controls of the British government, which forbade citizens from taking large sums of money out of the country. She was effectively a pauper in a tiara. To maintain the facade of the royal lady, she began to rely on the kindness of strangers, on lines of credit, and on the dangerous assumption that the bill would never actually come due. She was living on the fumes of her ancestry, writing checks against a social capital that was rapidly depreciating. And while Iris was busy playing the role of the glittering expatriate in Manhattan, a very different, very ruthless game was being played in London. The year 1947 was dawning, a year that would define the future of the House of Windsor for the next century. Her uncle, Lord Mountbatten, was at the zenith of his power. He was negotiating the partition of India, dismantling the British Raj with a surgeon's scalpel. Simultaneously, he was orchestrating his greatest dynastic coup, the marriage of his nephew Philip to the heiress to the throne, Princess Elizabeth. The atmosphere in the palace was one of extreme tension. The establishment was skeptical of the Mountbattens. They were seen as too German, too ambitious, too upstart. Philip was being scrutinized for every flaw. The family needed to be perfect. They needed to be boringly, unimpeachably respectable. They were building a fortress of middle-class morality to protect the crown, and thousands of miles away their wild cousin was dancing on the edge of a volcano, fueled by cocktails and bad financial advice. The crash came in July 1947, and it did not happen with the dignity of a tragedy. It happened with the banality of a farce. Lady Iris was in Washington, D.C., staying at a hotel, trying to keep the juggling act of her finances in the air. Contemporary reports indicate she faced bad check charges in 1947, though the exact store, amount, and circumstances were never officially documented. It was money for clothes, for the costume she needed to play her part. The check bounced. In the chaotic ledger of her life, it was likely just an oversight, a delay in a transfer, a mistake. But the shop did not care about her lineage. They cared about their $185. They filed a complaint. What followed was a scene so humiliating that it effectively erased 1,000 years of royal dignity in a single afternoon. The police arrived. They did not bow. They did not curtsy. They arrested her. The great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria was escorted to a police station, not a palace. She was subjected to the degradation of the booking process. Her fingers, which had once held the Queen's train at the Coronation, were pressed into black ink and rolled onto a government card. She was mugshotted, face forward, profile left, profile right. The camera that captured her image was not the portrait lens of Cecil Beaton, designed to mythologize, but the harsh flash of the district police department designed to criminalize. She spent the night in a cell, surrounded by the drunk, the disorderly, and the desperate. For a woman raised to believe that her blood made her untouchable, the psychological shock must have been shattering. The illusion of protection, the invisible shield of the monarchy, had evaporated. When the news hit the wires, it was a global sensation. Queen's cousin arrested, Lady Iris in jail. The headline screamed from the newsstands of London, New York, and Paris. In 1947, this was not just gossip. It was a scandal of nuclear proportions. It reinforced every negative stereotype about the aristocracy, that they were feckless, irresponsible freeloaders who believed the laws of common men did not apply to them. But for the Mountbatten family, specifically, it was a catastrophe. At the precise moment they were trying to sell Prince Philip as a serious, steady consort for the future queen, his first cousin was being fingerprinted for petty fraud in America. It made the Battenberg bloodline look tainted, unstable, and vulgar. The reaction from Lord Mountbatten was instantaneous and glacial. There was no circle the wagons mentality, no rush to provide legal aid or public support. Instead, the ice curtain descended. Some commentators have suggested that with his military background, he may have seen his niece's arrest as a serious embarrassment that needed to be contained. He did not see a frightened young woman who had made a mistake. He saw a liability. Later accounts suggest that she felt effectively cut off, and there is no public record of any official palace statement or financial support in response to the scandal. She was left to rot in the glare of the flashbulbs. But the ultimate punishment was yet to come, a social execution that would hurt far more than any night in a jail cell. The royal wedding of Elizabeth and Philip was scheduled for November 1947. It was to be the wedding of the century, a splash of color in a gray world, a celebration of the monarchy's survival. There is no confirmed record that she was formally invited or formally excluded from the wedding, and contemporary coverage leaves her absence ambiguous rather than documented as a deliberate snub. While her childhood playmate Elizabeth walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey in a gown embroidered with seed pearls, bringing a nation to tears of joy, Iris remained in exile in America, the criminal cousin who was not fit to breathe the same air. This was the moment the door was locked and the key thrown away. It was a message sent not just to her, but to anyone in the family who dared to step out of line. The institution survives. The individual is expendable. The psychological impact of this exclusion cannot be overstated. It severed the last tether Iris had to her identity. She was no longer a royal on tour. She was a royal outcast. The primal wound of her abandonment festered into a desperate need for validation. If her family wouldn't love her, perhaps the public would. If she couldn't be a princess, she would be a celebrity. Thus began the second, more tragic phase of her American odyssey, the hustle. Stripped of her dignity, she decided to monetize what was left of her name. She returned to New York not with her tail between her legs, but with a frantic, manic energy. She signed a contract to host a television show, The Versatile Lady Iris. The premise was vague, but the selling point was clear. Come watch the fallen aristocrat. She began to accept endorsements that would have been unthinkable a few years prior. She began taking on modest endorsement work for everyday consumer products. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. A woman raised in the hushed dining rooms of Kensington Palace, now smiling stiffly for a camera, holding a bag of greasy snacks, telling the American housewife that these chips were fit for a queen. It was a grotesque parody of royalty, a commodification of her heritage that bordered on self-harm. She even posed in promotional material for American car companies, draping herself over the hoods of automobiles like a showroom model. She appeared on game shows, answering trivia questions for cash, the studio audience laughing at her posh accent, unaware of the profound sadness behind the performance. She was selling pieces of her soul for rent money, cannibalizing her own history because it was the only currency she had left. Yet, even in this degradation, there was a strange, tragic bravery. Iris refused to go quietly into the night. She refused to retreat to a quiet country cottage and live in shame. She kept pushing, kept trying to carve out a space where she mattered. But the Mountbatten curse, the relentless ambition of her bloodline, had mutated in her. In Uncle Dickie, it manifested as a drive to rule empires. In Iris, it manifested as a drive to be famous, to be seen, to prove that she was still someone. But without the protective machinery of the palace, she was vulnerable to every predator in show business. Agents promised her stardom and delivered nothing. Producers used her name to get headlines and then canceled her shows when the novelty wore off. She was drifting in a sea of sharks, bleeding from the wound of 1947, and the sharks were circling. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, the golden girl began to tarnish. The novelty of the royal rebel was fading. A new generation of stars was rising. Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, women who had talent and sex appeal, not just a dusty title. Iris was becoming an anachronism, a relic of a pre-war world that America was rapidly forgetting. Her financial situation remained precarious, a constant tightrope walk between eviction and the next small paycheck. And back in London, the fortress was complete. Elizabeth was queen, Philip was Duke of Edinburgh, the Mountbattens had won. They sat on the throne of the world, untouchable, magnificent, and utterly cold. They had successfully erased the stain of Lady Iris from the official narrative. She was the ghost in the machine, the glitch that had been patched over. But ghosts, as the House of Windsor would eventually learn, have a habit of haunting the places that tried to bury them. And Lady Iris's descent was far from over. In fact, the darkest, most chaotic chapters of her personal life were just beginning to be written. But scandal fades quickly, and once the initial shock vanished, Lady Iris was left facing a quieter, more corrosive enemy, the slow erasure of her identity. The Mountbatten curse did not end with her social exile. It merely mutated, shifting from the public humiliation of police stations to the private, desperate search for belonging in a world that saw her only as a novelty act. As the era of the debutante gave way to the era of the beatnik, she found herself drifting further from the shore, seeking validation in the chaotic rhythms of a counterculture she was never built to survive. If the 1940s were the decade where Lady Iris Mountbatten lost her standing, the 1950s and 1960s were the decades where she lost her way. Having been stripped of her royal protection and commodified by the American media machine, she found herself adrift in a psychological vacuum. The adrenaline of the scandal had faded, the potato chip commercials had aired and been forgotten, and the novelty of being the Queen's cousin in exile was beginning to curdle into something sadder. The reality of a woman approaching middle age with no career, no fortune, and no home to return to. In this void, Iris did what so many displaced souls do. She sought to fill the emptiness with romance. But just as she had no head for business, she had no compass for love. Her upbringing in the stiff, repressed corridors of Kensington Palace had prepared her for a dynastic alliance with a duke, not for the messy, volatile, and predatory world of modern dating. She was a woman who craved warmth, who craved the noise and passion that had been denied to her in the royal nursery. And this hunger led her into the arms of men who were the antithesis of everything her family stood for. In 1957, she made a choice that felt less like a marriage and more like a declaration of war against her heritage. She married Michael Bryan. To the Mountbattens in London, who were now basking in the golden glow of the young Queen Elizabeth's reign, Michael Bryan was not just unsuitable, he was inexplicable. He was an American jazz guitarist. He inhabited a world of smoke-filled clubs, late-night jam sessions, and the improvisational chaos of the musician's life. He was talented, charismatic, and undeniably cool in a way that the stuffy aristocrats of England could never be. For Iris, he represented the ultimate rebellion. Marrying a jazz musician was a way of shouting that she was alive, that she was modern, that she didn't care about the Gotha Almanac or the rules of precedence. It was a union based on passion and rhythm, a desperate attempt to find a beat that she could finally dance to. But life is not a jazz standard, and a marriage built on rebellion rarely survives the mundane, crushing weight of reality. The couple settled into a life that was frantic and financially precarious. They were the bohemian Mountbattens, moving through a social circle of artists, actors, and drifters. In 1957, they had a son, Robin Alexander Bryan. The birth of Robin is a poignant milestone in this saga. Here was a boy who was the great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a child carrying the DNA of the most powerful dynasty in Europe, yet he was born into a rented life in America, far removed from the nannies and the ponies of his royal cousins. While Prince Charles was being groomed for kingship in the nurseries of Buckingham Palace, his cousin Robin was growing up in the backstage, chaotic atmosphere of a show business family. The contrast highlights the cruelty of the exile. The sins of the mother had been visited upon the son. Robin would grow up virtually unknown to his illustrious relatives, a branch of the family tree that had been pruned and left to wither on the ground. The marriage to Bryan, predictably, did not last. The pressures of money, always the Achilles heel of Lady Iris, and the volatile temperament of two artistic souls living on the edge took their toll. They divorced after only a few months, though the legal wrangling would drag on. Iris was once again alone, now a single mother struggling to maintain the facade of the lady while changing diapers and dodging creditors. The collapse of this second marriage marked a shift in the public's perception of her. In the 40s, she had been a glamorous scandal. By the late 50s, she was becoming a tragic figure. The gossip columns, once breathless with excitement, began to adopt a tone of pity or, worse, indifference. The headline, "Royal Cousin Divorces Jazz Musician," didn't have the same shock value anymore. It just felt tired. The world was moving on. The rock and roll revolution was beginning. The Beatles were on the horizon. The idea of a lady was becoming archaic. Iris was a relic of a bygone era, trying to stay relevant in a world that was rapidly losing its reverence for titles. As the 1960s swung into action, bringing with them a cultural tsunami that reshaped the world, Lady Iris found herself increasingly stranded. The aristocracy was no longer the primary source of celebrity. Pop stars and actors were the new royalty. Iris, with her clipped accent and her tales of the old days, seemed like a dinosaur. She tried to adapt, but her attempts often felt desperate. She continued to take whatever work she could find. According to later accounts, she even worked for a wig company, a detail biographers often highlight to show how far she seemed to have fallen from her royal beginnings. Imagine the Queen's first cousin, a woman who had stood on the balcony at the Coronation, now traveling door to door or managing sales for artificial hair. It was a humiliation that would have broken a weaker spirit. But Iris possessed a strange wrought iron resilience. She needed to eat. She needed to feed her son. So she swallowed her pride, adjusted her hat, and did the job. She refused to ask her family for help, and crucially, they refused to offer it. The silence from London during these years was deafening. By the 1960s, the royal family had successfully rebranded itself as the ultimate respectable middle-class family, despite their immense wealth. The Queen was the dutiful mother. Prince Philip was the modernization man. They were busy navigating the complexities of the Cold War and the decolonization of the empire. They had absolutely no interest in dredging up the embarrassment of Lady Iris. She was a problem that had solved itself by disappearing across the Atlantic. There were no invitations to Christmas at Sandringham, no summer holidays at Balmoral for her or her son. The correspondence had dried up. By the time he was advising Prince Charles and cultivating his image as a kind of national grandfather, Iris appears in the record mainly as a figure from his past, mentioned rarely, if at all. The ruthlessness of this ghosting is chilling. It wasn't just that they ignored her, it was that they actively erased her from the collective memory of the institution. In a final flailing attempt at stability, Iris married for a third time in 1965. Her groom was William Kemp, an actor and announcer. Once again, she chose a man from the entertainment world, a man who lived by his voice and his wits. And once again, the marriage was a short-lived disaster. It lasted only a few weeks before hitting the rocks. At this point, even the press stopped caring. 3 divorces, a trail of debt, a life that looked less like a Greek tragedy and more like a soap opera that had run too many seasons. Iris was 45 years old, and she was exhausted. The energy required to keep up the Lady Iris persona, the smile, the glamour, the pretense that everything was marvelous, was draining away. She realized that America, the land that had promised her reinvention, had instead consumed her. It had taken her youth, her novelty, and her dignity, and given her very little in return. It was in this state of exhaustion and disillusionment that she made the decision to move north. In the late 1960s, she left the United States and settled in Toronto, Canada. The choice of Canada is significant. It was a dominion of the crown, a place that still held a deep, if somewhat colonial affection for the royal family. It was less aggressive than New York, less judgmental than London. It was a middle ground, a purgatory where she could perhaps find some peace. But it was also a retreat. It was an admission that the great American experiment had failed. She wasn't going there to be a star. She was going there to survive. Toronto in the 1970s became the setting for the final quiet act of her life. She moved into a modest apartment far removed from the luxury of her youth. The woman who had been raised to believe she was semi-divine was now worrying about the heating bill and the cost of groceries. But in Canada, the dynamic shifted slightly. The Canadians treated her with a polite curiosity rather than the predatory hunger of the Americans. She was a local celebrity, a character. She found a small circle of friends who liked her for who she was, eccentric, grand, but fundamentally kind, rather than for who her grandmother was. She continued to work, never fully retiring, because she couldn't afford to. She hosted a local TV segment for a while. She worked in public relations. She lent her name to charities. But the sparkle was gone. The frantic ambition of the New York years had been replaced by a weary acceptance. Yet the pain of the exile never truly left her. Friends from her Toronto years spoke of a woman who was deeply lonely, who would occasionally let the mask slip after a few drinks and speak of her family with a mixture of pride and bitterness. She kept photographs of the Queen and the royal family in her apartment, a shrine to the people who had cast her out. She followed their lives through the magazines she bought at the drugstore, watching her cousins age, watching their children grow up, watching the weddings and the funerals from which she was banned. It is a heartbreaking image. The exile sitting in a small Canadian living room, watching the flickering television screen as the pomp and circumstance of the monarchy played out without her. She was the specter at the feast, the invisible relative who proved that the family firm was as ruthless as any corporation. As the 1970s wound down, Lady Iris's health began to fail. The lifetime of stress, of financial insecurity, of constant moving began to manifest in her body. She was a heavy smoker, a habit picked up in the jazz clubs and the nervous waiting rooms of her life. But even as her body weakened, her pride remained ironclad. She did not reach out to London for money. She did not sell her story to the tabloids for a quick payout, though she could have made a fortune by betraying the secrets of the nursery. In this, she proved herself to be more of a royal than the family gave her credit for. She adhered to the code of silence, even when the code had ceased to protect her. She bore her exile with a stoic dignity that was the only inheritance she had managed to keep intact. The tragedy of her final years in Toronto was the silence. She was surrounded by the noise of a modern city, but emotionally, she was on a desert island. Her son Robin was grown and building his own life, undoubtedly carrying the complex weight of his mother's history. The men were gone, the crowds were gone, the cameras were gone. What was left was Lady Iris Mountbatten, a woman who had tried to span two worlds, the ancient hierarchy of Europe and the modern meritocracy of America, and had fallen into the abyss between them. She was a woman who had tried to be versatile in a world that only wanted her to be one thing, a symbol. And when she failed to be the symbol they wanted, they stopped seeing her as a person at all. As 1982 approached, the final curtain was preparing to fall, not with a bang, but with a long, slow fade to black in a hospital room where the nurses didn't know and perhaps didn't care that the dying woman's great-grandmother had once ruled half the world. This solitary fade into the abyss stood in blinding contrast to the blinding radiance emanating from London at that exact moment in history. While Lady Iris lay forgotten in the sterile anonymity of her exile, the institution that had expelled her was ascending to a pinnacle of global adoration, creating a cruel and poetic symmetry. The dying breath of the outcast coincided perfectly with the triumphant roar of the monarchy's greatest revival, proving once and for all that the firm thrives, not by saving its lost sheep, but by burying them beneath the weight of its own glorious reinvention. The year 1982 was, in many respects, the apotheosis of the House of Windsor, the year the family finally achieved the perfection of image they had been chasing for half a century. It was the year of the royal miracle. Lady Diana Spencer, the shy kindergarten teacher who had married the Prince of Wales the previous summer, had given birth to Prince William, securing the succession and providing the monarchy with a glamorous, tabloid-ready future. Across the ocean, in the South Atlantic, Prince Andrew was flying helicopters in the Falklands War, returning as a conquering hero with a rose in his teeth. The monarchy was basking in a golden glow of military victory and maternal beatification. It was popular, it was invincible, and it was utterly intoxicated by its own success. But thousands of miles away from the cheering crowds of London, in the gray, muted corridors of the Wellesley Hospital in Toronto, the other side of the royal coin was facing a very different reality. Lady Iris Mountbatten, the ghost of the family's past, was dying. And she was dying as she had lived for the last 30 years, quietly, inconveniently, and largely alone. The collapse had been sudden, a betrayal of the body that mirrored the betrayals of her life. The diagnosis was a brain tumor, a cruel malady that attacks the very seat of memory and identity. For a woman whose entire existence had been a battle to define herself against the crushing weight of her ancestry, losing her mind was the ultimate indignity. In those final weeks of the summer of 1982, as the tumor pressed against the delicate architecture of her brain, one wonders what fragments of the past floated through the haze. Did she see the flashbulbs of the Stork Club in 1946? Did she hear the jazz trumpet of Michael Bryan in a smoky basement? Did she feel the weight of the velvet train she carried for Queen Elizabeth at the Coronation? Or did she simply feel the cold, sterile air of a Canadian hospital room, a place so far removed from the nursery at Kensington Palace that it might as well have been on the moon? There were no royal visitors. The Queen did not fly to her bedside. Prince Philip, her first cousin, did not interrupt his schedule. The brutal pragmatism of the firm held firm to the very end. To visit Lady Iris would have been to acknowledge her, and to acknowledge her was to remind the world that the Mountbatten blood was not flawless. It would have reminded the public of the bad checks, the divorces, the potato chip commercials, all the messy human debris that the monarchy had spent decades sweeping under the rug, so they stayed away. They let her die in the exile she had chosen, or perhaps the exile that had been chosen for her. On September 1st, 1982, Lady Iris Mountbatten took her final breath. She was 62 years old. The cause of death was officially recorded, the paperwork filed, and the machinery of the hospital moved on to the next patient. There was no lowering of flags, no mournful peal of bells from Westminster Abbey. The silence was absolute. However, death has a way of resolving administrative problems that life cannot. While Lady Iris, the person, was an embarrassment, Lady Iris, the corpse, was a logistical matter that could be handled with discreet efficiency. Following her death, the royal family finally stepped in, not with warmth, but with the cold competence of undertakers. Her remains were not buried in Toronto, the city that had sheltered her in her final lean years. Instead, she was brought home. It was a final, ironic journey across the Atlantic, the reverse of the hopeful voyage she had taken in 1946. She returned to England not as a star but as a box of ashes. Her funeral service was held at St. Paul's Bloor Street in Toronto, and afterwards her ashes were taken back to England and interred in the family chapel at St. Mildred's Church in Whippingham on the Isle of Wight. This church is significant. It is the spiritual heart of the Battenberg/Mountbatten clan, a place steeped in Queen Victoria's history. It is a place of marble effigies, stained glass, and the heavy, damp smell of old sanctity. The service was private, stripped of the pageantry that attends the funerals of working royals. There were no television cameras to record the faces of the mourners. It was a gathering of the few who remembered, and the few who felt duty-bound to attend. Finally, her ashes were interred in the family chapel. And here lies the supreme bitter irony of her life. In death, she was finally allowed to be a Mountbatten again. She was allowed to rest alongside her parents, the Marquess and Marchioness of Carisbrooke, and near the tombs of her illustrious ancestors. The stone walls that had barred her entry while she was alive, messy and human, now welcomed her with open arms once she was silent, safe, and reduced to dust. The institution loves a dead rebel far more than a living one. A dead rebel cannot give interviews, cannot pass bad checks, and cannot tarnish the brand. She had finally become suitable. But to simply bury Lady Iris in the crypt and walk away would be to miss the profound lesson of her life. Her story is not just a footnote in royal history, it is a structural diagram of how the monarchy functions. Lady Iris was the canary in the coal mine for the House of Windsor. She was the first modern royal to attempt to navigate the treacherous gap between privilege and independence, and her destruction proved just how impossible that gap was to bridge in the 20th century. She faced the dilemma that would later haunt Princess Margaret, Prince Andrew, and eventually Prince Harry. What do you do with a royal who has no throne, no defined job, but plenty of ambition and human desire? The system, that complex interplay of courtiers, tradition, and public expectation, is designed to support the monarch and the heir. Everyone else is spare parts. If the spare parts function well, they are kept and polished. If they malfunction, if they have too much personality, too many needs, or too little money, they are discarded. Lady Iris malfunctioned. She refused to be the quiet spinster cousin arranging flowers in a Grace and Favour apartment. She wanted to live. She wanted to taste the American century. And for that insolence, she was ground into dust. The ruthlessness of her Uncle Dickie, Lord Mountbatten, in cutting her off was not an act of personal malice, but an act of professional hygiene. He was building a dynasty that required the appearance of superhuman discipline. Iris, with her chaotic love life and her financial desperation, was a crack in the mirror. And in the Mountbatten philosophy, you do not repair the crack, you discard the mirror. Furthermore, Lady Iris's life exposes the terrifying fragility of royal status when it is stripped of wealth. We often assume that royalty is an intrinsic quality, a magic that exists in the blood. But Iris proved that royalty is actually a performance supported by infrastructure. Without the money to pay for the servants, the clothes, and the privacy, the royal mystique evaporates instantly. In New York, when she was broke, she wasn't a princess. She was just a woman with a weird accent and a bounced check. The police officer who fingerprinted her didn't see Queen Victoria's great-granddaughter. He saw a suspect. This is the terrifying truth that the royal family knows and fears. They are only special as long as they remain on the pedestal. If they step down, or if they are pushed off, they become ordinary with brutal speed. Iris's potato chip commercials were not just embarrassing because they were vulgar. They were terrifying to the establishment because they showed how easily the divine right of kings could be traded for a paycheck. In the final analysis, the tragedy of Lady Iris Mountbatten is a tragedy of timing. Had she been born 50 years later in the era of Instagram and global celebrity branding, she might have thrived. She might have been a fashion icon, an influencer, a woman who leveraged her title into a legitimate business empire, much like the modern generations have attempted. Her versatility, the desire to act, to model, to be on TV, would have been viewed as entrepreneurial rather than shameful. She was a modern woman trapped in an archaic timeline, crushed by a family that was still operating on the software of the 19th century. Today, if you visit the Isle of Wight, you can find her name in the chapel at St. Mildred's. It is carved in stone, finally permanent, finally fixed. But the real monument to Lady Iris is not in the church, it is in the silence that surrounds her memory. She is the forgotten casualty of the Mountbatten ascent, the human cost of the royal fairy tale. As we look back at the glittering images of the royal family on the balcony, the weddings, the jubilees, the perfect smiling tableaus, we must remember the figures who were cropped out of the frame. We must remember the woman who died alone in a Toronto hospital because she dared to be human in a family of icons. Lady Iris Mountbatten was the woman who tried to run away from the circus, only to find that the circus master never lets you leave. And even if you escape the tent, you will spend the rest of your life haunted by the music. Her life was a long, exhausting performance of a role she never auditioned for, and her death was the final curtain call to an empty house. She was the Mountbatten who didn't win, and in the brutal calculus of history, that is the only sin for which there is no forgiveness.